Now let's begin. So I'm Ken Graham, the president of the Canadian Society for Renaissance Studies. And I'd like to begin this open event by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. We acknowledge their traditional territories to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deeper understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Richard Streier, Salzburger Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus at the University of Chicago, who will deliver this year's international keynote, a lecture generously funded by the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. Because this lecture is following the Zoom webinar format, you will most likely want to write your questions throughout or at the end in the Q&A. I will give you some follow-up on that at the end. We may actually be able to ask the questions live then. Richard Streier epitomizes the Renaissance ideal, having established himself through the range and quality of his writings as one of the most important critics of English Renaissance literature in the last half-century. He made his name as a sharp-eyed and clear-headed reader of the 17th century religious lyric. His first book, Love Known, continues to be regarded nearly 40 years after its publication as the best study of George Herbert's poetry, and his essays on John Donne's Holy Sonnets famously inspired Margaret Edson's Pulitzer Prize-winning play, Wit. Here and in much of his work, Richard has consistently been one of our best close readers, and he has continued throughout his career to defend the importance of careful attention to literary form. But as Marjorie Levinson noted in PMLA in 2007, Richard's work exemplifies a new historical formalism. He was a leader of the historical turn in the 1980s and 90s, co-editing the important 1988 collection, The Historical Renaissance, with Heather Dubrow, and publishing his second monograph, Resistant Structures, in the University of California Press's New Historicism series. His historical expertise includes religion, as seen in his work on Herbert, Donne, and Milton, as well as in the edited collection, Religion, Literature, and Politics in Post-Reformation England, politics, as seen in much of his work on Shakespeare, and in the edited collections, The Theatrical City, and Writing and Political Engagement in 17th Century England, and philosophy, as perhaps best seen in its 2011 monograph, The Unrepentant Renaissance, which ranges from Petrarch and Luther to Montaigne and Descartes to Shakespeare and Milton. More recently, he has added law to his docket, co-editing the 2013 collection, Shakespeare and the Law, with Braden Cormack and Martha Nussbaum. Much of this work is explicitly multidisciplinary, and his collaborators include historians, philosophers, and even a US Supreme Court justice. Richard's landmark essays are too numerous to name, but a short list would have to include Radical Donne, Luther and the Real Presence in Nature, Milton Against Humility, Against the Rule of Reason, Praise of Passion from Petrarch to Luther to Shakespeare to Herbert, an earlier essay on the Tempest, I Am Power, Normal and Magical Politics in the Tempest, which takes its title from Aimé Césaire's post-colonial adaptation, Une Tempête, and two essays on King Lear, Faithful Servants, Shakespeare's Praise of Disobedience, and King Lear and Social Security, published last year in Raritan. Richard has himself been a faithful servant to our profession. In addition to mentoring a generation or two of students at Chicago, he served from 2004 to 2016 as editor of Modern Philology, has edited special issues of several other journals, and has led National Endowment for the Humanities summer seminars for college and high school teachers on Renaissance and Reformation in Tudor Stuart England and on George Herbert and Emily Dickinson. He's also known on the conference circuit as that guy in the front who asks the really hard questions. and he shows no signs of slowing down. He currently has 3 essays forthcoming and a new book on Shakespeare titled Fine Issues, Agency, Skepticism, and Other Shakespearean Puzzles is with readers. I fear I may have to lengthen the poem I wrote for his retirement several years ago, and with which I'll end. It's modeled on Herbert's sonnet, Prayer 1. It's called Richard 1. Richard, the critic's critic, Herbert's voice, Shakespeare's faithful servant, Luther in brief, a guide to Milton's proud demonic choice, charting Donne's path to radical belief. Engine against the critic's scheme, no fool, the first to lead, to follow still the last, master of every hermeneutic tool, philosophy, philology, the past, lover of fine cuisine and wine and art, good talk and company, both large and small, the cause of wit in some, wisdom in all, a friend aspiring to Horatio's heart, resistant, unrepentant, seeking good, loved when known, someone to be understood. And with that, I turn it over to Richard 1, the one and only.
Well, thank you very much for that amazing introduction, Ken. I feel like you've made it a hard act to follow, but I will do my best. And just warn people that this is kind of a longish paper with a lot of twists and turns. So just sort of sit back and try to enjoy the ride. And if anything needs clarifying, be sure to ask a question when we get to the question period. So this is called Civilization and Its Discontents, How Montaigne Haunts the Tempest. In the second act of The Tempest, an elderly Neapolitan counselor who's been presented to us as compassionate and farsighted is given a fantasy of what he would do if he were ruler of the apparently uninhabited island on which he and the other high-ranking members of the Neapolitan court, including the actual king, Alonso, have been stranded. The vision is of a pre-civilized golden age. No name of magistrate, letters should not be known, riches, poverty, and use of service, none. Contract, succession, born, bound of land, tilth, vineyard, none. No use of metal, corn, or wine, or oil. No occupation. All men idle. All. Well, Gonzalo is interrupted by an apparently shrewd remark by 2 of the members of the court party, but he continues undaunted, grandly asserting that, quote, all things in common nature should produce without sweat or endeavor. Treason and felony, he insists, would not be known, nor would sword, pike, knife, or gun. Now, ever since the 18th century, it's been known that these lines are a close adaptation of a passage from early in Montaigne's essay De Cannibale. Yet the significance of this borrowing remains in question. Why did Shakespeare want this primitivist vision to be part of his play? An obvious answer is that he intended to critique it. The addressee of the speech, the King of Naples, responds, "Thou dost talk nothing to me," and Gonzalo seems to accept this characterization. The interruption of the speech consisted of the younger members of the court party pointing out an obvious contradiction in the vision. Gonzalo asserted that his imagined Commonwealth knows, quote, no sovereignty, and yet he had initially presented himself as king on it. The latter end of his Commonwealth seemingly forgets the beginning. Now, this might be seen as too easy a critique, since the most famous imagined Commonwealth of the period, Thomas More's Utopia, is a republic established by a king, King Oedipus. And the comments are made by Prospero's wicked and usurping brother, Antonio, and Alonso, the King of Naples, wicked and would-be usurping brother, Sebastian. But the undercutting remarks do seem to invite us to consider the vulnerabilities of either the vision itself or the whole attempt at imagining a society that is at once natural and innocent. More than the wit of the cynical youngsters, the figure of Caliban, introduced to us as foul-mouthed, vengeful, and an unrepentant rapist, would seem to be a new world native, very unlike Gonzalo's innocent people. So given Caliban, the play as a whole becomes, in Stephen Greenblatt's words, quote, an act not of homage, but of aggression toward Montaigne's apparent belief in the beauty of a natural society. But that might not be the whole story either, especially when one takes into account the other essay of Montaigne's that Shakespeare cites in the play. The presence of Montaigne turns out to have a deeply unsettling effect on what seems to be the value structure of Shakespeare's play. If one follows another recent scholar, David Quint of Yale, who's just as shrewd as the young courtiers, De Cannibal is another text that, quote, forgets its beginning, since the Golden Age vision is undercut by the essay's later concentration on native warfare, and Montaigne's hatred of warfare is well established. This means that the essay as a whole is much more critical of the native culture described than it might seem. But in neither case of seeing the positive vision as undermined, Greenblatt's or Quint's, does the undercutting reading respond adequately to the lyricism of the two passages in question. Montaigne does seem to admire the natural society that he depicts before he gets into the matter of the wars the natives wage. And we're almost certainly not intended to think of Gonzalo as merely an old fool. It has got to be to Gonzalo's credit that he's capable of imagining a society without treason, etc., just as it's part of the sweetness of Montaigne's nature that he can imagine it. So certainly the borrowed passage raises the question of what natural man is like, and it's equally certain that it brings the New World context into the play. But these considerations do not respond to the internal emphases of the passages of description that Gonzalo provides. The first passage is interrupted after it lists all the things that the imagined society does not have: government, writing, social distinctions, agriculture, legal systems, and conventions, metal, corn, wine, oil, culminating in the assertion that this society would have all men idle, all. The repetition makes this assertion especially emphatic. And Gonzalo anticipates the charge that this is a sexist labor fantasy by adding, and women too. And he tries to preclude a hot sexual fantasy by adding that these idle women are, quote, innocent and pure. And he'd already dropped the mention of lack of clothing, nul vêtement, from Montaigne's list of negatives. Gonzalo could be seen as forestalling a Quint-type critique by dropping Montaigne's mention of pardon, le pardon, also being lacking, and by specifying in the passage after the interruption that there are no weapons in this society, no sword, pike, knife, gun, or need of any engine of war, so that the idleness of Gonzalo's citizens is much more total than that of Montaigne's. Unlike the society that Montaigne evokes, in Gonzalo's, there are no cooking utensils as well as no weapons. There are cooking grills as well as swords and spears in Montaigne's. Gonzalo's concluding thought is that the world he's imagining, that in the world that he's imagining, nature should bring forth of its own kind all foison, all abundance to feed my innocent people. The idea is abundance, foison, without labor, without sweat or endeavor. Foison is a rich word, and although a French one, it's Shakespeare's alone. It doesn't appear in Montaigne or in the 1603 translation by John Florio. though Florio does transliterate Montaigne's equivalent word, uberte, Florio's uberty. And all three texts mention abundance, abondance. Foison is rare for Shakespeare. He uses it once in the sonnets, once in Antony and Cleopatra, once in Measure for Measure, and once in the Two Noble Kinsmen. The word always signifies benign natural fertility, the spring and foison of the year in Sonnet 53, the result of the Nile at its height in Antony, the plenteous womb of the year or of a happily pregnant young woman in Measure. In Macbeth, Macduff assures Malcolm that Scotland has foisons enough to satisfy anybody. The Tempest is unique in that it contains two appearances of the word. The second is in a second set piece, the only court masque, which is an elaborate, aristocratic, and musical spectacle that Shakespeare ever produced, the Masque of Ceres, who's the goddess of grain and harvests. Shakespeare later in Two Noble Kinsmen wrote of Ceres foison. The masque is even more lyrical than Gonzalo's fantasy, but in the masque, foison occurs in the evocation of a world extremely different from that of an Arcadian or pre-civilized golden age. The contrast between the two appearances of this word can, I would suggest, lead us to the deepest reason why Shakespeare inserted the passage from De Cannibale into the play. The Masque of Ceres is precisely counterposed to Gonzalo's Commonwealth. It follows immediately upon and is meant to extend Prospero's severe admonition to the young man of the affianced couple, who are the audience to the masque. And Ken will now share the screen with you so you can see the passage I'm about to read. If thou dost break her virgin knot before all sanctimonious ceremonies may with full and holy rite be administered, no sweet aspersion shall the heavens let fall to make this contract grow, but barren hate, sour-eyed disdain, and discord shall bestrew the union of your bed with weed so loathly that you shall hate it both. Therefore take heed, as Hymen's lamps shall light you. And I think we can let the screen go now, Ken. The diction of this speech enacts its meaning. In the world that this speech evokes, the Latinate ponderousness and near pleonasm of sanctimonious ceremony are entirely positive. A rite, R-I-T-E, has to be not only holy, but full. A metaphorical aspersion, a religious term used in a secular context, is sweet. And most interestingly and significantly, a contract is presented as having the essential property of nature and being able to grow. The contract here is with nature, so to speak. Unless the sanctimonious procedures governing sexuality are followed, the marriage will, Prospero says, become a source of pain and disgust, both in itself and in the presumably hateful offspring that it will produce. Sebastian and Antonio were quick to point out that it's unclear how Gonzalo's Commonwealth can be one of innocent and pure sexuality, rather than being one of whores and knaves, as they say. But in the world that Prospero presents, sexual purity is guaranteed by rules. The Masque of Ceres continues the emphasis on the ceremonial constraint on sexuality. Only temperate nymphs are invited, and they are to celebrate, again, a contract. Venus, who has no regard for the rules of marriage, is excluded, so that no, quote, wanton charm can be done to the couple whose vows are that no bedrite shall be paid till Hymen's torch be lighted. Bedrite, R-I-G-H-T, is a wonderful pun, including both the legal and the ceremonial. It also might, in some sense, include a natural right, but only within the other senses of the term. The Mask is most of all a celebration of cultivation. In it, nature brings forth nothing of its own kind. The opening invocation of the bounteous Ceres evokes her rich lees of wheat, barley, vetches, oats, and peas. This gives us both a sense of variety and a celebration of the most fundamental, ordinary, necessary, and long-standing cultivars, both grains and legumes. None of these can be counted on to grow wild, and vetches, which are mostly used for forage, suggests that there's a whole ecology here. But it's a planned one. The nibbling sheep from the mountains maintain the flat meads that are thatched with stover to support the sheep. The rivers of Ceres have banks with pionned and twilled brims, which means that workers, pioneers, have built embankments that are fortified by layers of crisscross branches. There's further evidence of cultivation in the next landscape invoked, that of pole-clipped vineyards, grapevines pruned in the spring to produce better and more abundant fruit at harvest time. Finally, Ceres is seen as cooling herself off at her sea marge, sterile and rocky hard. This note of sterility is rather surprising, but functions as a celebration of boundaries, specifically of keeping the sea in its place. Within the story, so to speak, of the Mask, Ceres is summoned by Iris to entertain Juno and with her to bless the contract, and in grand language that again includes but transcends the legal, quote, some donation freely to estate on the putatively well-behaved young lovers. Juno offers social and biological gifts that constitute human happiness, something like Aristotle's eudaimonia, honor, riches, marriage blessing, long continuance. Ceres, on the other hand, stays within her realm, the realm of cultivated non-human nature. It is in Ceres' speech that the key word from Gonzalo's vision recurs. She offers earth's increase, foison plenty. This seems at one with Gonzalo, but the next line specifies barns and garners never empty. The foison here is contained within and made available by human constructs. This is abundance within civilization. In further contrast with Gonzalo's vision, where the foison is, so to speak, automatically produced, so that there's no anxiety whatever attending it, Ceres here asserts that through the means, human and natural, that she has specified, scarcity and want will be avoided. So in this vision, these exist as possibilities, though discounted ones. One other factor enters this most majestic vision at this point. After the temperate nymphs are called to help celebrate the contract, again, a set of male figures is called in to enter into a country dance, and dancing is essential to masks. The male figures are sunburned sickle men of August weary. So it turns out that the foison here envisaged requires not only human ingenuity, barns and garners, pionned banks, but also human labor. This is real labor. It's not presented as pleasant or redeeming. Those who do it are weary from it. The humans involved are defined by their labor. They are sicklemen or reapers. They can dance here, but as in Herrick's great poem, The Hop Cart, about harvest celebrations, everyone knows that the pleasure of such an occasion is not meant to drown the pain of the workers, but, in Herrick's wonderful pun, to make it spring again. One critic claims that the sicklemen here constitute the only image of laborers in a Jacobean mask. This may or may not be true. I leave it to the mask scholars to sort this out, but it does point to a very striking feature of the Tempest. The issue in the play of physical labor and who is to do it. The play is emphatic that physical labor is necessary and that only certain people or classes of people should do it. It might well be that the most amazing feature of Gonzalo's vision is not all poison, but, as I've already suggested, and Antonio has sneered, all idle. The issue of physical labor is present from the very beginning of the play. In the opening storm scene, the boatswain instructs his aristocratic passengers, keep below, saying, you mar our labor. Keep your cabins, you do assist the storm. The boatswain's concern, following the commands of his shipmaster, is to get the mariners to work effectively. The aristocrats are making a lot of noise and continue to get in the way. When the boatswain's presumed blasphemy is answered with a curse, the boatswain turns to Sebastian and the whole aristocratic group and says, work you then. This is an exasperated endgame retort, not a serious proposal. Antonio insists that the aristocrats are not afraid of drowning. They're apparently less averse to this outcome than they are to doing labor to prevent it. This may not seem surprising in a hierarchical, pre-democratic society, but it turns out that it actually is so. In the text from which Shakespeare seems to have drawn some of the details for this scene, William Strachey's narrative of a storm in Bermuda, encountered by an English ship headed for Virginia in 1609, Streicher comments wonderingly on a phenomenon exactly opposite to what Shakespeare presents. Streicher notes that in the storm, the better sort, even our governor and admiral themselves, not refusing their turn. There was not a passenger, gentleman or other, but was able to relieve his fellow. And to hammer the point home, Streicher makes explicit that this included, quote, such as in all their lifetimes had never done an hour's work before. Now, in the Tempest, aristocrats do not labor, even when their lives depend on it. Physical labor is done by others. This is as true for Prospero as it is of Antonio and company. Prospero is entirely dependent on his native slave Caliban for physical labor. Now, we've learned that Caliban's mother was the foul witch Sycorax, and that although Caliban has a human shape, he is freckled, whatever that means. It is hinted that the relation between Prospero and Caliban was not always hierarchical. Caliban is that Caliban whom now I keep in service, but now it is definitively so. As Prospero and his daughter prepare to approach Caliban, we learn two more things about him. One, that he's consistently surly. He never yields us kind answer. And two, that the daughter, Miranda, has an aversion to him. She says, "'Tis a villain, sir, I do not love to look on." But neither of these considerations matter because, Prospero says, we cannot miss him. He does make our fire, fetch in our wood, and serves in offices that profit us. Now, in context, this is very odd. We know that Prospero has another servant that he discovered on the island, and that this other creature is quite remarkable. Rather than being human, it's a spirit, and one that's able, quote, to fly, to swim, to dive into the fire, to ride on the curled clouds. Now, this omnicompetent spirit is entirely at Prospero's service. He enters with an assertion that he's prepared to answer Prospero's best pleasure. And we immediately learn that this figure, named Ariel, was responsible for the tempest that was dramatized in the opening scene. It was a performance of his in which he was following Prospero's specific commands. So of Prospero's two slaves or servants, one would think that the non-human one, the one who can do things that humans can't, would be the one who's indispensable. But we're never told that about him. Ariel seems to be drawn on only for special occasions. He's needed for the particular moment in which the play occurs, the moment when, by accident most strange, Prospero's European enemies and their entourage have been brought into the realm in which Prospero can exercise his special powers, and they are the ones for whom the Tempest is conjured. Ariel is needed to carry out that spectacle and the rest of Prospero's project in relation to the elite Europeans, namely to make them repent their previous treatment of him. And Ariel is needed to create the majestic vision of the mess. On the other hand, what Caliban does are things that any able-bodied person could do: make a fire and fetch wood for it. Yet Prospero cannot miss Caliban. The point is that it's inconceivable that Prospero should fetch his own wood or make his own fire. When Prospero wishes to see what Ferdinand, the prince, is willing to endure for his love of Miranda, Prospero assigns him Caliban's task of log bearing. Both the young prince and Miranda characterize this task as baseness. Ferdinand associates it with slavery. The other offices that Caliban performs for Prospero and Miranda are not specified, but they must be of the same order as the two that are mentioned: log bearing and fire making. Caliban's services are strictly economic in the etymological, not the modern sense, despite the mention of profit. They have to do with the physical maintenance of the oikos, the household. These mean tasks involve the provision of necessaries. Without Caliban, Prospero and Miranda would have no fire, presumably for heat, for fuel, says Prospero, for firing, says Caliban, since there's no direct mention of cooking in the play. It's not clear that without Caliban, the Prospero family would have food of any kind. When Caliban imagines laboring for another master, Stefano, Alonso's drunken butler, Caliban promises to replicate what Caliban has presumably done for Prospero. "Let me bring thee where crabs grow. I with my long nails will dig thee pig nuts, show thee a jay's nest, and instruct thee how to snare the nimble marmoset. I'll bring thee to clustering filberts, and sometimes I'll get thee young scamels from the rock." Nobody knows what a scamel is. This is another version of something like foison, and here it comes through labor and ingenuity, snaring the marmoset, and in the continuation of the speech, dams for fish. It's hard to imagine Prospero performing any of these actions, let alone meaner tasks. When Caliban imagines leaving Prospero, Caliban states that he will no longer scrape trenchering nor wash dish for his old master. But the question might be asked, why is all this a problem? Shouldn't the fact of not physically laboring provide the ruler or master with leisure, allowing him to do, using Hannah Arendt's distinction, work rather than labor? One of the interesting things about The Tempest is that while it does denigrate physical labor, it does not seem to idealize work or art. Prospero's rule is never easy or serene. This is obvious in the state of his relations with Caliban, but is largely true of his relations with Ariel as well. With regard to the stage Tempest, Prospero has to assure himself that the result was what he intended, asking with apparent anxiety, "But are they, Ariel, safe?" When, after commending Ariel for doing the Tempest job exactly, Prospero informs him that there's more work, that is, work for Ariel, this announcement is not received happily. Ariel experiences his work as labor. His service does involve a promise of manumission, and Ariel is not, like Caliban, regularly tortured. But like Caliban, Ariel acts under threat of punishment. When he raises the issues of his manumission at a moment that Prospero finds unpropitious, Prospero threatens to duplicate or better the punishment that Ariel's previous master, Sycorax, imposed on Ariel for disobedience. Ariel does at times seem to take pleasure in his work. He narrates his performance of The Tempest with relish. But as far as I can see, it's only Caliban in the play who evokes the experience of laboring freely. He remembers having done so in the past for Prospero. I loved thee, and showed thee all the qualities of the isle. And he imagines, as we have seen, doing so for Stephano, happily using his long nails, fetching scamels, etc. Prospero never has a moment of relaxation. His art requires a constant assertion of will. We've heard him lecturing Ferdinand and Miranda before the mask, and we know that the mask, though it's intended, indeed, though it is, as Ferdinand says, harmonious charmingly, is truly a labor as well as a work of art. It's the product of Ariel as Prospero's industrious servant. Prospero cannot even enjoy the production. It breaks off when he remembers, quote, the foul conspiracy against him. Now, that would hardly seem to be a matter of grave concern, given the agents involved, Stephano, the drunken butler, Trinculo, who's designated a jester in the folio cast list, and Caliban. But the recollection of it puts Prospero into a state of rage that Miranda claims is unprecedented. Never till this day saw I him touched with anger, so distempered. One is tempted to say that Miranda hasn't been paying attention or is extenuating, but perhaps this moment does constitute a special case. It may be that Prospero actually allowed himself to relax for a few moments, to enjoy the show and forget his consuming project. And it may be that his awareness that he allowed himself such a moment is what has put him into such a state. He devises a menu of physical torments for the lower class conspirators, but then turns his attention to his real enemies, the aristocrats who deprived him of his dukedom. For them, he's devised more upper class torments, psychological ones, inward pinches rather than physical ones. At the beginning of Act 5, Prospero is delighted, and again perhaps a little surprised, that he's succeeded in imposing his will. My charms crack not, my spirits obey, he says. Ariel reminds him that they're still doing work, and Prospero is still very angry. In what's clearly a great moment in the play, Prospero decides not to continue the punishments he has inflicted on his enemies. In a beautiful image related to the poetry of the Mask, with its crisp channels, Prospero restores his aristocratic enemies to the clear pool of sanity, removing, quote, the ignorant fumes that mantle their clearer reason. But there's no pleasure in this for Prospero, and no letting go of anger. With regard to Antonio, Prospero refuses even to acknowledge their kinship, saying, most wicked sir, whom to call brother would even infect my mouth. He offers to forgive, but not to forget, saying, I do forgive thy rankest fault, all of them. This is juridical pardon. It's beyond what Montaigne's warrior cannibals do. Recall that they do not have le pardon, but it's not a reconciliation. The acknowledgement of Caliban at the end of the scene is exactly parallel to this. It manifests the same mixture of official reconciliation and continued rage. What is happening at that moment is that the aristocrats are sorting out their servants. Two of these fellows, Prospero tells Alonso, you must know and own, that is Stephano and Trinculo. The other one, Caliban, Prospero must. Just as Antonio is addressed as a most wicked sir, not a brother, in being, quote, forgiven, Caliban is characterized as a thing of darkness, not a person, as he is being, quote, acknowledged. That Prospero can't enter into Miranda's wonder at the human creature she beholds is not surprising. But Prospero also doesn't seem able to enter into Gonzalo's joy at how well everything has turned out. To Gonzalo's vision of a blessed crown being dropped on the young couple, it's Alonso rather than Prospero who says, Amen. To Gonzalo's invitation to rejoice beyond a common joy at all the outcomes, Prospero says nothing at all. For Prospero, the only model of productive life is one that involves constant work, constant effort of the will. The one moment in which Prospero revels in his so potent art is the speech in which he abjures it. Prospero's plan for his own life, after witnessing the marriage of Ferdinand and Miranda, is not to rule in Milan, but to, quote, retire there yet again, though this time with presumably less disastrous results than the last time, succession rather than usurpation. The one future activity he imagines for himself is to devote, quote, every third thought to his death, which he almost certainly views as a relief. The sense of weariness at effort explains why the most beautiful and memorable speech in the play, our revels now are ended, is not about fertility or productiveness, but about quietly fading into nothingness, into air, into thin air. It's the consummation for which Hamlet devoutly wishes, and it eliminates Hamlet's anxiety by placing dreams ante rather than post-mortem. But what is the alternative to this vision of blissful release from all activity? One could imagine the role of work in productive life differently. One possibility would be that described in the Commonwealth of Utopia, where the amount of labor required of almost every individual is minimal, and the total amount produced maximal. Labor is not eliminated, but is not constitutive of anyone's life, except those who choose to have it so. Another possibility is the Protestant solution that Max Weber identified, to see work and labor as positive, as divinely appointed. Milton, for instance, saw work as part of human dignity. Other creatures all day long rove idle, unemployed, says Milton in Paradise Lost, compared to man. The absolute alternative is Gonzalo's Commonwealth, a vision of human life where work is not necessary at all, and idleness reigns. Montaigne certainly found this an attractive idea. He found a strong tendency to idleness to be a determining aspect of his own character. But instead of seeing this as a flaw, he associates it with freedom, liberté. In De la Vanité, Montaigne asserts that la liberté et l'oisiveté are his two ruling qualities, mes maîtresses qualités, and also his two favorite qualities, mes qualités plus favorites. The connection between them is a shared antipathy toward care, soin, souci, solicitude. One might think that this would mean not caring at all about worldly things, and perhaps retreating as far as possible from them. But this is neither Montaigne's recommendation nor, in actual life, his practice. As one scholar notes, Montaigne's point in praising idleness is not to commend pure inactivity and lethargy, but rather to free himself from mental disquiet. It's a matter of managing one's will. The essay by that title, De ménager sa volonté, is about freedom. It has, in a way that might seem unusual for Montaigne, a definite moral. Il faut ménager la liberté de notre âme. We must husband the freedom of our soul. This liberty is a matter of internal equilibrium. It's not a matter of retreat. In life, one has to take on various projects, private and even when necessary, public. Montaigne says, I do not want a person to refuse to the charges he takes on, attention, steps, words, and sweat and blood if need be. The point is to attend to such charges with the mind or spirit holding itself ever in repose, not without action, but without vexation, without passion. L'esprit s'étonnant toujours en repos, non pas sans action, mais sans vexation, sans passion. One must not have a violent and tyrannical intensity of purpose. In particular, in chastising injuries, it's important to keep anger out of it. The ideal is to maintain, even in great affairs, une grande nonchalance. And he says, liberté. These latter two terms are the same for Montaigne. The contrast of this ideal with the dramatized inner state of Prospero for virtually the entire play could not be more stark. Ferdinand's comment that when the mask breaks off, Prospero is in, quote, some passion that works him strongly, conveys exactly Montaigne's sense that passion operates as a form of compulsion, as if from outside the self. Prospero himself states at this moment that he is in exactly the state Montaigne warns against, vexed. But the play presents Prospero as having been so from the beginning, in the opening interactions with Miranda, with Ariel, and with Caliban. He's constantly touched with anger. And we recall that in the opening sentence of De Montaignac, Montaigne states that in comparison with most men, few things touch me. Peu de choses me touchent. Moreover, it should also now be clear that in Prospero's past retreat to his library, as dukedom large enough, Prospero was not following Montaigne's model. So as a friend of mine puts it, Prospero fails on both sides of Montaigne's prescription, public and private. The essays offer a critique of the way Prospero conducts himself and his project. This critique might seem to go unvoiced in the play, but this is where we must recall that Gonzalo's vision stresses idleness even more strongly than Montaigne's does. This means that to someone who knows the essays, the evocation of Golden Age idleness might bring with it the critique of Prospero's passionate involvement in his project, his violent and tyrannical intensity of purpose. There seems, however, to be a major obstacle to this conclusion. It arises from the second borrowing from the essays in the Tempest, a borrowing much more recently noticed and less well known than that from De Cannibal. The passage is from the essay on cruelty and seems to praise strong passion as necessary to virtue. In Prospero's great moment of moral self-correction, Prospero claims that he's going to let his affections towards his aristocratic enemies become tender. His reason for claiming that he's going to do this is that Ariel suggested it. And Prospero reflects that if a spirit who is but air can imagine a human doing this, becoming tender towards his enemies, then it makes sense for an actual human to do it, on the categorical grounds of biological and psychological identity. Shall not myself, one of their kind, that relish all as sharply, passion as they, be kindlier moved than thou art? The biological and ethical emphasis here relies heavily on the semantic range of kind. But it's important to retain an awareness that the sense is a question. Prospero is contemplating an issue about feeling, not having one. And the next part of the speech changes direction. The issue of kindness is dropped. Instead of contemplating an internal change, Prospero announces that he is now, in this very moment, having one. And I think we can share the screen and you can see the few lines I'm about to read. Though with their high wrongs I am struck to the quick, yet with my nobler reason, 'gainst my fury, do I take part. the rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. Okay, we can go back. This is a decision, not an effusion of feeling. It's a decision made on the basis of a maxim. The rarer action is, the decision is to act with or in virtue. What virtue means here is for the agent to establish an internal ethical hierarchy in which reason is nobler than passion, conceived of as excessive fury, and to choose to take reason as his basis for action, rather than taking its competitor, passion, as such. The condition of the object of the action has nothing to do with the decision. It's a decision made entirely on principle, through an act of simultaneous intellection and will. Now, for purposes of self-consistency, Prospero adds a reference to his previously stated business in tormenting the court party. They being penitent, the sole drift of my purpose doth extend not a frown further. The grammar of this, they being penitent, is nicely poised between being conditional and being indicative. It allows Prospero to present to himself, and I suppose to Ariel, a conditional as if it were indicative, as if the condition has been fulfilled. In any case, the decision has been made. It doesn't depend on seeing whether his courtly victims have in fact become penitent. Ariel is told to release them without being commanded to make any prior effort to ascertain the matter. The issue is bypassed under the guise of assuming its success. That conception, the decision has been made entirely on the basis of a conception of virtue. That conception is what brings Montaigne's essay of cruelty into Shakespeare's text. Now, the essay begins with a reflection on the relation of virtue to vengeance, and we'll show you this, this piece again. Ken? So this is how the essay begins in Donald Frame's translation. It seems to me that virtue is something other and nobler than the inclinations toward goodness that are born to us. Souls naturally regulated and well-born follow the same path and show the same continence in their actions as virtuous ones. But virtue means something greater and more active than letting oneself by a happy disposition be led gently and peacefully in the footsteps of reason. He who through a natural mildness and easygoingness, une douceur et facilité naturelle, should despise injuries received, would do a very fine and praiseworthy thing. And here Florio has, should no doubt perform a rare action. But he who outraged and stung to the quick, jusqu'au vif, by an injury, should arm himself with the arms of reason against this furious appetite for vengeance, and after a great conflict should finally master it, would without doubt do much more. The former would do well, the other virtuously. One action might be called goodness, bonté, the other virtue, virtu. For it seems the name of virtue presupposes difficulty and contrast, and cannot be exercised without opposition. Okay, we can go back now. In these terms, Prospero's great speech, despite its abstract recognition of the natural, kindness, seems to move entirely in the grander arena of virtue. Prospero could not perform the rarer action unless he were in the grip of a strong passion. And Shakespeare shifts to the domain of rare from the realm of nature, facilité naturelle, where Florio, following Montaigne, puts it, to the realm of reason. So as the final sentence in the quotation notes, the passion is the necessary occasion for the virtue. On this account, if Prospero were less incensed, he would be less virtuous. Now, almost all critics and scholars who've noted this borrowing have read the passage in this way, as praise of virtue. But to read the passage in that way is not to attend to Montaigne's essay as a whole, and not even to its full opening paragraph. The next sentence after that on virtue, needing internal opposition, reads, "Perhaps this is why we call God good, strong, liberal, and just, but we do not call him virtuous. His operations are wholly natural and effortless." So suddenly it looks as if we're in a situation where we have to choose between being virtuous and being godlike. Something tricky is going on here. Montaigne continues to praise the effortfulness of virtue, the quote, easy, gentle, and inclining path that guides the footsteps of a good natural disposition is not the path of true virtue. But suddenly Montaigne brings himself up short. He reflects that in the terms that he's established, Socrates would be little deserving of commendation, since Socrates did not have unruly passions to be countermanded. Yet Montaigne holds Socrates to be, quote, the most perfect soul that has come into my knowledge. Socrates was completely at ease in his soul. So now there's a new ethical hierarchy. The person who's developed a character such that he does not have temptations to do wrong, that is, the person who has Aristotelian temperance, sophrosine, is ethically superior to the person who successfully struggles with temptations, who has Aristotelian continence and krateia. But Montaigne continues, although the temperate person is morally superior to the continent one, the latter is still finer, plus beau, than the person simply provided with a nature easy and affable, une nature facile et debonaire, and having an inborn distaste, dégoûté par soi-même, for vice. Now, this still seems to allow for serious, if somewhat diminished, admiration of the continent person, the one who through reason overcomes internal opposition and has virtue in the sense that the opening of the essay defined. It makes sense that the third type of person is, quote, innocent, but not virtuous. Merely avoiding falling into a vice is not the same as being virtuous. This all seems perfectly coherent and sequentious. But suddenly the line of thought gets trickier. Montaigne decides that he will say a word about himself, un mot de moi-même. Needless to say, this word becomes, as the one critic, aside from myself, who actually reads the whole essay, recognizes, becomes the essay's core subject. Montaigne notes that he is himself of the third type mentioned above. My virtue is a virtue, or should I say an innocence, that is accidental and fortuitous. He does not owe his freedom from major vices to his reason. He owes it to his nature, either first or second. He was either born so or his upbringing created it. Without effort, he holds most vices in horror. He then reflects that reason produces opinions, and that in many cases men's behavior is better than their opinions. This leads him to a rather startling question, one that brings us back to the opening discussion of mere goodness as opposed to virtue. Could it be true that to be wholly good, pour être bon à fait, must be by some occult, natural, and universal property, without law, without reason, without example, sans loi, sans raison, sans exemple, innocence and goodness, without, we're back to De Carnaval. In case we have missed the connection, when Montaigne goes on to discuss his own softness, mollesse, of disposition, such that he can't stand cruelty even to animals, Montaigne notes that, quote, savages do not shock me so much by roasting and eating the bodies of the dead, as do those who torment and persecute the bodies of the living. So, and here's my conclusion. So even the opening passage on the nobility of virtue does not actually idealize effort, will, and care. Yet these are what the Tempest offers as essential to civilized life and to projects of any sort, colonial or reforming. Agriculture and household maintenance require labor, and labor, even in the most perfect civilized society, as in the Mask, requires an underclass to perform it. Everything is work. Even as we've seen, pardoning is work. As in Gonzalo's vision, endeavor and sweat are equated. Genuine freedom is imagined only in a non-human context, Ariel merging with the elements. Inner freedom is no more available to Prospero than is any positive version of idleness, Golden Age, or utopian, or Montaignean. No wonder that, as I noted earlier, the most positive fantasy that Prospero can entertain is to dissolve peacefully into nothingness, into air, into thin air. If we take the matter one step further and accept the naive but almost irresistible and possibly correct parallel between Prospero's situation and Shakespeare's, it would seem that by the time he wrote The Tempest, Shakespeare may have come to see writing and staging plays as work, and as coercive, morally dubious work at that. He may have felt that he needed a secular indulgence to be set free, as the epilogue spoken by Prospero suggests. Montaigne, on the other hand, in his work and in his life, could rely on the liberté provided by une grande nonchalance. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. That was fabulous, rich, nuanced paper. Okay, we're going to try to set up here for the Q&A. And I'm going to open up my Q&A window, and at the same time, I'm going to invite everybody to write in questions or simply raise your hand. And I think that that will move you to the front of the line where I should be able to see your hand. And my understanding was that I will then be able to unmute, but I've got a note from the event tech. You may have to be the one who unmutes anyone. Richard, we'll see.
Oh, I have to do it? Okay.
Maybe.
Okay.
So while we wait, I mean, let me ask you about something. I think you said that Caliban is the only character who speaks of laboring freely in the play. But I wanted to ask you about that, and also about Ferdinand and his labor in carrying logs as he does. And what seems to me the commonality there is that they both speak, or they both act out of love. At least that's what Caliban says. I love thee. And it was in that mood that he did these things. And that would also clearly be what Ferdinand is, what's motivating Ferdinand to do the labor that he is doing. So I guess the question is, what's love got to do with it? What does love mean in the poem? What's its significance as an example of sort of freely offered gift or service, however you want to conceptualize that? How does that work with your argument?
That's a great question, Ken. Thank you. There are a number of critics who do think that Ferdinand sort of happily takes on this task because it's a labor of love, so to speak. But it's very clear from the plot and also his own language, this is a task imposed on him by Prospero. He's made to do this. And he considers it degrading. I mean, we have this constant language of it's a mean task, it's slavery, but he's willing to do it because it seems like it's a test of his love for Miranda. So there's no sense that this is labor taken on happily out of love. Rather, it's labor done because it's a test, and he is doing it because he's in love with her. But it's not as if the labor is itself an act of love that he's chosen, that he's willingly doing, that he presents as a gift. Whereas in the Caliban case, before the breakdown of the relation between Prospero and Caliban, which of course revolves around the rape attempt on Miranda. But before that happened, and of course years and years go by before that happens, because Miranda is a little child when they first come, and Prospero's already Caliban's already a teenager. So he's got to wait until, because after all, what he wants from Miranda is not sex but children. So he wants to produce little Calibans. So he's got to wait 10, or she's about 3 when they come to the island. She's got to wait 10 or so years. They've been there 12 years. So there's a long period before that happened. And during that period, even Caliban says that he loved Prospero. Prospero loved him. They shared knowledge. They shared, and in that context, Caliban seems to happily have shown Prospero things, and not to have felt in any way demeaned by finding him nuts and showing him the clear springs and all the things that he. And then when he wants to duplicate his happy relation to a master with the drunken butler, Stefano, who he wants to replace Prospero, he imagines doing the same thing, that he's going to happily, make dams for him. So there's a sense that he does these acts out of love, not because they're imposed on him. So I think that's the real difference. I think the thing that you've pointed to, where Ferdinand is obviously doing Caliban's job. I mean, log carrying seems to be Caliban's main job, because it's cold in Bermuda in the winter, and they need fire. They need firewood. And now, who cuts the logs exactly, and how they get cut is a question one critic raises, and there's no answer in the play. But anyhow, Ferdinand's made to carry around logs, which is Prospero's job, which is Caliban's job. But he doesn't like it. He doesn't do it out of love. He doesn't say, "Oh, I'll do it." Instead, he's got to do it. And I think critics get confused about this, and because of the log carrying, they think these are both acts of freedom, as you've suggested. Whereas in the former relationship that Caliban had with Prospero, it really was an act of free service, as opposed to a punitively imposed, resented, because Ferdinand keeps saying it's a mean task, it's horrible. Whereas Caliban doesn't seem to initially have viewed his household labor, so to speak, in that way. But it's a great question.
Great answer too. So I'm not seeing questions. So please do ask, put them in the Q&A or raise hand if you have questions. I have another one.
Okay.
Which, and it's about the word office or offices. Prospero says that Caliban serves in offices that profit us.
Right.
I just wonder about the significance of using the classical term there, and whether that has any significance to how work is being conceptualized there. Presumably, if it can be referred to as an office that he's fulfilling, that Caliban's fulfilling, that imputes a certain kind of dignity to it.
No, that's a good point. And to that, I don't have a good answer, because it seems to be, these offices that profit us have to be along the same lines as the other kinds of labor that Caliban does, which is simply, menial labor, physical labor of the most low class, in the play's estimation, in the aristocrat's estimation, low class sort. it might be that at that point, since Prospero is explaining why they need to see Caliban, since Miranda doesn't want to see him. She says, do we have to do this? Yeah, I don't like the look on the guy. And then Prospero gives that little speech about, well, we need him. We can't miss him. So we have to go see him. So it might be that he's sort of trying to sort of beef up Caliban's status a little bit for Miranda's sake. But that's a very good question. I think I might need to think more about why offices rather than say labors in that spot. I think that's an excellent question, and it's, as you say, it's a rather high word for low tasks. And it's a puzzling line because he says, he does make our fire, carry our logs, make our fire, and other offices that profit us, but he never says what those are. So the whole thing is a little mysterious about why that's even added. But I think you're right. I think the offices there deserve some thought, which I have to confess I have not until this very moment given it.
Okay, so I think I'm getting a question here, which I'll pass on. I think. So
Ronald Hubert raised hand.
I can't see that. So if you can see that, can you? Okay, there it is. Now I see it. Okay, I'm going to ask. I may have to ask Ron.
I think I've unmuted now.
Yeah, I think you're unmuted. So go ahead, Ron.
Thank you very much. That was a fabulous presentation. I enjoyed the revision of my sense of Montaigne's contribution to this play.
Thank you.
Obviously, the Tempest offers us a temptation to read allegorically. I think more so than almost any other play by Shakespeare, and Montaigne helps us to read it allegorically as a fable of the public commonwealth. And your emphasis has been on that, and rightly so. But I wonder if we might not also read it as a fable of Prospero's guilty past. And if we do that, what kinds of, do you think we could, do you think we're getting any hints to the effect that Caliban may actually be Prospero's illegitimate offspring, that Sycorax may be his despised mistress, and that there may be a psychodrama going on here that is maybe runs parallel to the political drama that all of us see in it, and that might be just as powerful a motivation for Prospero's both vigilance and wrath as any of the public causes that you have adduced. I'll stop there. I'm interested in your response.
That's a nice story. So we know Miranda is Prospero's daughter because she comes with him from Milan, so she's presumably legitimate. And we're told that Caliban was already there and was a young child. Sycorax is, it sort of depends whether we believe the account that Prospero gives of the prehistory before he got to the island, which of course he can only know about from Ariel, presumably, and perhaps from Caliban. So we're told that they were both there on the island, that Sycorax died before Prospero arrived. And Caliban is a small child, but presumably old enough to sort of continue without his mother. We don't know exactly how old Caliban was when Sycorax died. We know that Sycorax penned Ariel up into a tree because he wouldn't obey her commands, whatever they were, her earthy and abhorred commands, which sound kind of sexy, but we don't know what they are. But he won't do it, whatever it is. And he's in the tree for 12 years, and then Prospero releases him. So so it certainly it looks as if Caliban can't be Prospero's natural biological child, or Sycorax the mother. But I think where your point takes hold is that Caliban is an adopted child, and Prospero takes him into the household, and as he says, lodges him in the same cell. Prospero doesn't seem to have a constructed house. He doesn't build anything. He doesn't have a garden. He doesn't have anything. He doesn't build anything. He's not a colonist in any normal English sense. All he does is control servants. So he's much more, and as historians would say, he's much more a Spanish version of a colonist, where the English want to have settlements and the Spanish want to control people. So he seems to live in a cave, a cell of some kind. And he says he lodged Caliban in the cell with his daughter, Miranda. And I think that this is where Prospero's guilt about this whole thing that you're pointing to comes into play, because he lodges Caliban, who is 12 or so years older than his daughter, in the same room with her, basically. And 12 years go by. I mean, for some reason, Shakespeare is very insistent on telling us exactly how long they've been on the island. And given that Shakespeare is so often vague about time, I mean, how long has it been in Hamlet since old Hamlet died? Well, we don't know. How old is Hamlet? Well, we don't know. How long is Othello and Cyprus? How long have they been married? Well, we don't know. But in this case, we know. 12 years, I keep saying it. Now in 12 years, so we know Miranda's 3 when they come to the island. So by the time the play starts, she's 15 or so. So meanwhile, Caliban has been residing in the same cell with this girl who's now become a nubile teenager. And Prospero is completely surprised that Caliban makes a sexual overture at this girl, just as he was completely surprised. See, Prospero is always surprised that people he loves betray him. So just as he was surprised when his brother, who he made basically acting duke and gave him all the powers, took over the job. Guess what? Who would have thought? And I think it's the same kind of thing. So I think that this is someone who, in 2 key cases in his life, has been surprised by things that any normal person would have taken to be obviously a problem. So that's where I think the guilt towards Caliban and sexuality, and the special rage that Prospero feels towards both Caliban and Antonio, the rage not just of someone who thinks he's been done wrong, but someone who can't accept the fact that in some deep sense it's his own fault. So that's a long-winded answer to a version of, I think, what you're seeing, what's behind the kind of scenario that you've hypothesized. Does that all make sense? I don't know if our question is still there.
There's somewhere, I'm going to go on with another question. So here's a question from Anton Bergstrom. Thanks for the fascinating paper. I was interested in how at a number of times you use the word project to describe Prospero's activities. And then you also near the end mentioned projects, colonial or reforming.
Right.
You might also think of Shakespeare's artistic project. Could you elaborate on whether you're specifically associating projects with work versus labor, with activities of passion? Also, are projects the work of civilization or modernity specifically? Thanks.
No, it's another excellent question. It's, I mean, I take the word directly from the play. So the first line of Act 5 is Prospero saying, "Now does my project gather to a head." And it's a rich line because it might have an alchemical meaning of projection, where there's an alchemical term where you're trying to sort of turn, alchemists are always trying to turn various other things into gold. And projection is part of the, so gathering to a head might be that his alchemical experiment is working. But it clearly has our meaning as well, as just as a kind of planned long-term action blueprint, something like that. And yes, I mean, I think that it is associated with civilization, with having definite designs, as Keats would say. And I think there are, there are a number of projects in the play, and one of the great projects of the period that the play is interested in is the Colonial Project, since the New World stuff is clearly put into the play for us to notice, not just in Montaigne, but there's another reference to the Bermudas. Caliban's name might be a transform of cannibal. I'm never sure whether I believe that or not, but everyone says it, so maybe it's true. So there's that project, but the Colonial Project, which is also imagined as a civilizing project some of the time, is one set of projects. But Prospero's main project is this project of producing. He wants to produce, he doesn't just want to punish his enemies, he wants to morally transform them. He wants them to be sorry for what they've done to him. Not just pay for it punishment-wise, but be sorry. That he wants them to repent. And he says, he has in a big speech in the middle of the play, he has Ariel talk to the wicked courtiers and tell him, look, what I want from you is heart sorrow and a clear life ensuing, which is the basic Protestant definition of penitence, of repentance, that doesn't involve a priest or a ritual, but involves inner contrition and change of life. So he wants that especially from his main enemies, of course, his brother, Antonio, but also Alonso, apparently the King of Naples, conspired with Antonio in some complicated way, as did Sebastian, Alonso's brother. So what he wants from them is repentance. So that's his project in the play, apart from Caliban. What's interesting in relation to that is that the project, if that's his project, his success rate is 1 out of 3. And the person who actually expresses sorrow about having contributed to Prospero's usurpation is Alonso, the King of Naples. And it seems to happen with him because he thinks his son has died, has drowned. And somehow grief seems to be an element that led him to this sorrow, not Prospero's punishment of him. Because Prospero drives these guys crazy, but he can't make them repent. And by the end of the play, Antonio is exactly the same as he was at the beginning of the play. He's making snarky remarks about Caliban, and there's absolutely no indication that he's changed his character. So in terms of Prospero's main goal in his project, he puts in all this effort and it fails. And I think that's an important feature of the play. It's part of this sort of sense of effort not really paying off. So anyhow, that something like that would be the answer I'd give to the what a project is in the play.
Okay, we have more questions waiting, so let me get to another one. The next, so David Gay has a question that goes back to Gonzalo's speech and the sense of the possible contradiction there, and points to, in particular, Gonzalo's phrase, "my innocent people," and then wants to contrast that and ask about the contrast between that moment in the play and the later moments when we have Prospero speaking of our rebels and using the collective pronoun, as well as the reference to our life in the Mask of Ceres. So I guess there's an interest there in the difference between the sort of singular possessive and plural, and lots of ways, I guess, to go with that. So where would you want to take it in the light of your argument?
No, that's like Ken's question about offices. That's something I haven't really thought about. Our rebels. Well, he's clearly there. He is clearly speaking of the people watching The Mask. But of course, it ends up being a speech about all of humankind. Our little life is rounded by a sleep. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, meaning we, human beings. There, Prospero seems to be speaking for all of mankind. The my innocent people, I mean, I think Gonzalo is just taking pleasure in his fantasy. I don't think he's asserting sovereignties. I don't think, I mean, critics say all the time that Sebastian and Antonio are right and Gonzalo contradicts himself. And I don't think that really holds any water, because as I said, utopia is a republic without a king, founded by a king. So, but yeah, the shift to between singular and plural, I think, is very interesting. And I don't have anything in general to say about it, except that Prospero sometimes, that in his most memorable speech about wanting to dissolve into nothing, generalizes his situation. And I think that's interesting. And I think it's important for the play that that's the speech that everyone remembers from the play, because it's the most beautiful speech and it's about just turning into nothing. And isn't that great?
Thanks. I don't know if we ask the room monitor, is there time for one more quick question? I think we're at 2:31. So technically we're out of time.
We have 10 minutes of overtime if you want to go into
Okay, because we have one more question I think is I'd like to ask here. It's from Megan Salinger. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm curious about the role of female labor as presented in this work. There are obviously no laboring women in the play, but one of Miranda's only memories is of women tending to her, which Prospero seems surprised to find she remembers.
Yeah.
She later notes that hers is the only face she knows. As such, she obviously doesn't remember their faces, only their labor. So I'm curious about both the role of women's work as well as this kind of erasure that's occurring.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I think here, where I think it's very interesting is that well, one of the features of, I mean, I am quite convinced that Shakespeare knew More's Utopia quite well. I think everybody did. And by the later 16th century, it's available in Latin and in English translation. And one of the striking things about utopia is everybody works, everybody. Women, children, there are no aristocrats. And because everybody works, nobody has to work for a very long time because there's so many more people laboring. Gonzalo goes out of his way to say that when he says everybody's idle, to add women too, to say so that it's not saying, okay, the men are idle and the women do the work, which is a not unfamiliar situation with regard to household work, to economic work in the Greek sense of having to do with the oikos. So he goes out of his way to say that the women, that nobody works, including the women. So he's very there. So he seems to be aware of the problem of women doing work, even if men don't. So I think that's the clearest sign in the play that if I'm right, that the play just sees really no distinction between high-class work and low-class work, that it's all work. It's all work in our sense, not in Hannah Arendt's sense of labor versus work, but just it's all labor or it's all work. It all takes effort. And the play is weary with regard to effort. So that I think it would take in women's work also. And one way of maybe getting this into the play is it's not clear how or whether Ariel is gendered. So this character is often played by a woman, or played by a woman in sort of neutralizing costume. So the character, or it could be played by a kind of a boy who doesn't have any obvious gender, as it would have been in Shakespeare's case. It probably would have been played by a boy actor, 12, 13. So if Ariel if Ariel is gendered female, then you have a sense that one of the things that Prospero is relying on is female labor, but that's not specified in the play, and it's something that a production would have to add. So I'm not quite sure how hard to push that. But if you wanted to see Ariel as a female figure, then we get a lot of dramatized female labor that is going to involve ultimately manumission, is going to involve ultimately getting out of labor and going back to the elements, kind of the way Prospero wants to, but not into thin air, but into nature. So I'd say Gonzalo's thought that he wants to put women in the same class as men is the important moment. And then the question of the gender of Ariel in production could bring the kind of issue you're raising to the fore if a director wants to. So I think it's a perfectly legitimate extension of the play, but it's not directly authorized, so to speak, by the play.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Richard. If we were live in person, I would now lead the applause, but I know that you're being applauded virtually across Canada. And I want to thank you very much for speaking to us today. And we're over time, so we've got to stop, and we have a couple more events still to go today as well. But great, thanks.
Well, thank you for giving me the occasion to do this, and thanks again for your wonderful introduction.
Okay, we'll be in touch.
Great.
Thanks, everyone. See you later on.
Be well, everyone.